They stopped me at the gate on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after I buried my grandfather in a dusty cemetery outside Phoenix. A security guard in a crisp uniform blocked my rental car while a silver-haired man in a golf shirt stepped out of his Mercedes. "This is private property," he said, barely glancing at the deed I held in my hand. "Your grandfather was a confused old man living in a trailer. Whatever paper you're holding means nothing here. Before the next part begins, let me know where you are in the world. If you want to follow stories like this, hit subscribe." He crumpled my deed copy and shoved it in his pocket. His hands were steady, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. Fear. He didn't know I was a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing fraud. He didn't know my grandfather left me more than just land. He left me evidence. And he certainly didn't know that his entire community was sitting on a legal nuclear bomb. I was about to light the fuse. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper, and the air conditioning was set too cold. I sat across from Evelyn Caldwell, watching her slide a document toward me, a deed dated 1952, bearing my grandfather's family name, Walter Howard, 1,000 acres in Maricopa County, Arizona. The paper had yellowed with age, but the legal description was clear as day. I'd flown in from Chicago, expecting a modest inheritance, maybe the trailer, some savings, perhaps a few acres of desert scrub. What I got instead was a puzzle that didn't make sense. "Mr. Howard," Evelyn said, removing her reading glasses, "your grandfather never sold this land, not a single acre. I've spent 2 weeks verifying this at the county recorder's office, and what I found is unusual." I leaned forward. "Unusual how?" She pulled out a map and laid it beside the deed. "This is the current plat map for the area. You see this subdivision here, Desert Crown Estates, 180 homes, clubhouse, pool, golf course. The whole development sits entirely within the boundaries of your grandfather's original parcel." I stared at the map, trying to process what she was telling me. A dull pressure built behind my eyes, the kind that comes when your brain refuses to accept what it's seeing. That's impossible. That community has been there for decades. I remember my grandfather mentioning it years ago. He said they were his neighbors. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "They're not his neighbors. Mr. Howard, according to every document I can find, they're his tenants. Except they've never paid a dime of rent, and they don't even know it." She explained that in 1989, a company called Crown Development Group had filed paperwork with the county claiming the land was unowned desert acreage available for development. They had created a subdivision, established an HOA, and sold lots to families who had no idea they were buying stolen property. "There's no record of any deed transfer from your grandfather to Crown Development or anyone else," Evelyn continued. "Someone either falsified records or simply hoped no one would ever check." The confusion in my chest began to harden into something else. I thought about my grandfather, a quiet man who lived alone in a trailer at the edge of the desert, who rarely called, who seemed to have given up on something long before I was old enough to understand what. Did he know? Evelyn reached into a folder and pulled out a stack of photocopies. "I found these in the county archives, letters from your grandfather to the HOA and to county officials, dating from 1990 to 2015. He knew. He tried to fight, but no one listened." I took the letters and flipped through them. His handwriting was careful, precise, the penmanship of a man who understood that words on paper were supposed to mean something. In one letter from 1993, he'd written, "I am requesting, for the 4th time, a meeting to discuss the boundaries of my property and the unauthorized construction occurring on it." The response, clipped to the back, was a form letter from the HOA's attorney. "Your claims have been reviewed and found to be without merit. Further correspondence on this matter will not receive a response." 25 years. He'd fought for 25 years, and they'd worn him down until he had nothing left. The hardness in my chest spread outward. This wasn't confusion anymore. It was the beginning of something sharper. That afternoon, I drove out to Desert Crown Estates. I needed to see it for myself, this community built on my family's land. The entrance was impressive stone pillars, wrought iron gates, a guardhouse with a uniformed security officer. The sign read, "Desert Crown Estates, established 1989, a premier community." I pulled up to the gate and rolled down my window. The guard looked at my rental car with barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you?" I handed him a copy of the deed. "I'm Christopher Howard. I'm the landowner." He didn't even look at it, just picked up his radio and muttered something I couldn't hear. 5 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up, and a man in his early 60s stepped out. Silver hair, golf tan, the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "I'm Victor Stanton," he announced, "president of this HOA for 18 years, and you must be Walter's grandson." He said my grandfather's name like it tasted bad. "Mr. Stanton, I have documentation showing that this entire development was built on land belonging to my family. I'd like to discuss." He held up his hand. "There's nothing to discuss. This community has been here for 35 years. We have lawyers, we have title insurance, and we have 180 families who aren't going anywhere." He glanced at the deed in my hand, then looked back at me with a thin smile. Without taking it, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, pressing it against my chest. "That's our HOA attorney. If you want to waste your money on a lawsuit, be my guest. But I should warn you, people who make trouble for this community tend to find that trouble has a way of finding them back. Legal fees add up. Reputation matters. I'm sure you understand." He let the implication hang in the air. It wasn't a threat about assessments, it was something worse. A promise that he knew how to make someone's life difficult in ways that never quite crossed the line into actionable. I'd seen this kind of intimidation before in my work, the kind that left no fingerprints. "Go back to Chicago, Mr. Howard. Enjoy whatever else your grandfather left you. But this," he gestured at the gates behind him, "this isn't yours. It never was." As he walked back to his Mercedes, I sat motionless in my car. The business card was still pressed against my chest where he'd left it. I looked down at the deed on my passenger seat, then at the gates of Desert Crown Estates. Something had shifted inside me during this conversation. The confusion was gone. The grief had retreated to a place where it couldn't cloud my judgment. What remained was clarity, cold, focused, absolute. He thought he was dealing with a grieving grandson who would fold under pressure. He didn't know that I'd spent 12 years as a forensic accountant, tracing fraud through shell companies and doctored ledgers. He didn't know about the leather notebook I'd found in my grandfather's trailer filled with dates, amounts, and names that meant nothing to me yet. But they would. My grandfather had spent 25 years collecting pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve alone. Now it was my turn to finish what he started. 3 days after my encounter with Victor Stanton, I sat in the Phoenix office of Diane Ortega, a real estate litigation attorney whose reputation for winning impossible cases had reached me through Evelyn Caldwell's network. Her office was cluttered with case files and legal volumes, the walls covered with framed judgments from lawsuits she'd won against developers, title companies, and yes, homeowners associations. "I've reviewed the documents Evelyn sent over," Diane said, tapping a thick folder on her desk. "And I have to be honest with you, Mr. Howard, what you're describing sounds almost too egregious to be real. An entire subdivision built on land with no valid deed transfer. That's not a clerical error. That's systematic fraud." I nodded. "That's why I'm here. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with before I decide how to proceed." Over the next 2 weeks, Diane and I conducted what she called a forensic title examination. The process was slower than I'd hoped. The Maricopa County Recorder's Office was backlogged with requests, and certain archived documents from the 1980s required a formal written application that took 5 business days to process. Some files had been moved to off-site storage during a renovation in 2015, adding another layer of bureaucratic delay. But I'd learned long ago that fraud investigations reward patience. We requested every document related to my grandfather's original parcel, the 1952's deed, subsequent surveys, tax records, and any recorded easements or transfers. Then we requested the same for Desert Crown Estates, the subdivision plat, the HOA formation documents, the CCNRs, and the title chain for the development company. The first anomaly appeared on day 8, when the archived survey records finally arrived. "Look at this," Diane said, spreading 2 maps across the conference table. "This is the original survey from 1952, showing your grandfather's parcel boundaries. And this is the subdivision plat filed in 1989 when Crown Development created Desert Crown Estates." I leaned in and studied the lines. The boundaries didn't match, not even close. My grandfather's parcel extended almost half a mile further east than the subdivision plat acknowledged. They literally redrew the lines, I said. Diane pointed to a signature at the bottom of the 1989 plat. Gerald Hutchins, licensed surveyor. I looked him up. He lost his license in 1994 for falsifying boundary reports in 2 other developments. By then, Desert Crown was already built and occupied. And back in '89, the county planning office had 3 staff members reviewing submissions for the entire eastern region. It wasn't hard to slip something through. The second anomaly was even more damning. In the HOA formation documents, Crown Development had declared the land unencumbered desert acreage acquired through county auction. But when I cross-referenced this with county auction records from 1987 through 1989, there was no record of any such auction. The land had never been sold by the county because it had never belonged to the county. It belonged to Walter Howard. Someone had simply invented a transaction that never occurred. "This is where your forensic skills come in," Diane said. "Can you trace who signed off on these filings?" I smiled for the first time in days. That's exactly what I do. I spent the next week in my hotel room, surrounded by documents and my grandfather's leather notebook. The notebook had seemed random at first, pages filled with dates, dollar amounts, names, and cryptic abbreviations. But as I cross-referenced it with the county records, patterns began to emerge. My grandfather had been tracking the same inconsistencies I was finding now. A notation from 1992 read, "Survey marker moved, reported to county, no response." Another from 2003, CCNRs filed without my consent, property described incorrectly. Attorney says no standing. He'd documented everything. But here's what he'd missed. The pattern wasn't random. Every falsified filing occurred in March, the same month the county planning office submitted its annual budget review. Staff were overwhelmed, and oversight was minimal. Someone had timed the fraud deliberately. My grandfather had collected the pieces, but hadn't seen the calendar. I did. Diane's next discovery took longer than expected. She had submitted a corporate records request to the Arizona Corporation Commission, but the database linking historical filings to current entities was being migrated to a new system, causing a 4-day delay. When the results finally came through, she called me immediately. "I pulled the corporate filings for Crown Development Group," she said. "Guess who the founding partners were?" I waited. Victor Stanton and his father, Raymond Stanton. Raymond died in 2008, but Victor has been the sole director ever since. Crown Development is technically still active, but it hasn't filed an annual report since 2012. I understood immediately. A dormant corporation that had never been properly dissolved could still be held liable for fraud. Victor hadn't just inherited his father's position in the HOA, he'd inherited the original sin. On my last day of initial research, I made a discovery that shifted everything. Diane had mentioned that HOA disputes often followed patterns, the same people causing trouble, the same tactics used to silence them. So, I searched the county court records for any lawsuits involving Desert Crown Estates. There were 7 cases over the past 15 years. The outcomes varied, but the pattern was clear. 2 cases had been dismissed on procedural grounds. 2 had settled under confidential terms. 1 homeowner had withdrawn their complaint abruptly after filing no explanation, given one had been forced into binding arbitration where the HOA's preferred arbitrator ruled against the resident, and 1 had simply gone dormant, with no activity for 3 years before being closed. 7 challenges, 7 defeats, different methods, same result. I called Diane that evening. "I think this goes beyond land fraud," I said. "The pattern of silencing dissent, the varied tactics to shut down challenges, someone is protecting something bigger than just a boundary dispute." Diane was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking there's financial irregularity, too?" I looked at my grandfather's notebook, at a page I'd initially skipped over. It was a list of special assessment amounts, charges levied on homeowners for community improvements. Next to each amount, my grandfather had written a single word, "where." He'd been asking the same question I was about to ask. Where did all that money actually go? I think my grandfather knew. I said, "He just couldn't prove it alone, but I can." The 7 lawsuits gave me names. The names gave me addresses, and the addresses led me to the people the Desert Crown HOA had spent years grinding down. I started with the case that had been withdrawn without explanation, a complaint filed by a woman named Helen Nakamura in 2018. The court records showed she'd accused the HOA of imposing arbitrary and excessive fines before suddenly dropping the case 63 days after filing. No settlement, no explanation, just silence. Her house was a modest single story at the edge of the subdivision, noticeably smaller than the surrounding homes. When she opened the door, I saw a woman in her early 70s with tired eyes and soil-stained gardening gloves. "Mrs. Nakamura, my name is Christopher Howard. Walter Howard was my grandfather." Her expression shifted from suspicion to something softer. "Walter's grandson," she repeated quietly. "He told me someone might come eventually. I didn't think it would take this long." She invited me inside, and over tea served in chipped ceramic cups. She told me her story. In 2017, her husband of 44 years had passed away from pancreatic cancer. To honor his memory, she'd planted a small garden of chrysanthemums in her front yard, his favorite flower. Within a month, the HOA had cited her for unauthorized landscaping modifications and imposed a fine of $15,000. $15,000 for flowers, she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly around her cup. "I couldn't pay. I'm on a fixed income, so they put a lien on my house, my home of 26 years, and suddenly they owned a piece of it because I planted flowers for my dead husband." I asked her why she'd dropped the lawsuit. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. This came from the HOA's management company 3 weeks after I filed. 12 pages of legal threats, foreclosure proceedings, defamation, counterclaims, a demand for their attorney fees if I lost. She handed it to me. The letterhead read, "Sentinel Property Management, Professional HOA Administration Services." The language was clinical, designed to overwhelm rather than inform. No signature from Victor Stanton, no fingerprints from any board member, just a corporate machine engineered to make fighting back feel impossible. I was 70 years old, Mr. Howard. I was alone. The letter said I could lose my house even if I won. I didn't have the strength to find out if that was true. Derek Manning's experience was different, not surrender, but defeat. He was a 45-year-old former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside IED left him paralyzed from the waist down. His house was one of the nicer ones in the subdivision, purchased with his military disability benefits and a VA loan. The problem had started when he'd installed a wheelchair ramp at his front entrance without submitting an architectural modification request. The HOA had demanded he remove it. When he refused, citing the Fair Housing Act, they'd sued him. "I wanted to fight," Derek said, wheeling himself to a filing cabinet stuffed with legal documents. "I wasn't going to let them bully a disabled veteran, so I fought for 18 months. He'd lost on a procedural technicality. His accommodation request had been filed 3 days after the HOA's internal deadline, a deadline buried in paragraph 47 of the CC&Rs. But Derek had something the others didn't, a lawyer who'd requested financial discovery during the litigation. "They fought like hell to keep these sealed," he said, handing me a manila folder. "My attorney managed to get partial records before the case was dismissed. Inside were HOA financial summaries from 2015 through 2017, incomplete, but revealing. I scanned the pages and stopped at a line item that appeared repeatedly: Infrastructure Maintenance, Stanton Construction, LLC. The amounts varied: $42,000 here, $67,000 there, but the contractor was always the same. "Stanton Construction," I said. "Any relation to Victor?" Derek's jaw tightened. "His company. He votes to approve contracts that go to his own business. Everyone on the board knows. No one says anything." Sophia Reyes told a third kind of story, not intimidation, not litigation, but quiet economic strangulation. She was 38, a single mother of 2 who worked as a hospital administrator. During the pandemic, she'd been furloughed for 4 months. When she fell behind on her HOA fees, a total of $2,400, the board had initiated foreclosure proceedings. No phone call, no email, just a certified letter saying I had 60 days. She'd borrowed the money from her sister, barely making the deadline. But what haunted her wasn't the near miss, it was what she'd noticed while scrambling to understand her situation. "I work in hospital finance. I know how to read a budget. When I looked at the HOA's annual statement, something felt wrong. She'd noticed that administrative costs had tripled over 5 years while services had declined. Pool maintenance was cut from weekly to monthly. Landscaping crews shrank from 4 workers to 2. Yet the fees kept rising. By the end of the week, I'd spoken with 5 of the 7 lawsuit homeowners, plus a dozen others. The stories varied in texture: grief, defiance, fear, resignation, but they shared a common architecture, a system designed to extract money while providing minimal accountability. I compiled the numbers from Derek's discovery documents alongside Sophia's observations and my own research. Over the past 10 years, the HOA had collected nearly $2 million in fines and special assessments beyond regular dues. Stanton Construction had received approximately $780,000 in contracts during the same period. Yet the visible improvements, a repaved parking lot, some landscaping updates, a renovated clubhouse entrance couldn't account for more than $400,000 in actual work. The gap was enormous. And now I had a company name to trace. On my last evening of interviews, I returned to Helen's house to thank her. As I was leaving, she stopped me at the door. "Your grandfather tried to organize us," she said. "Back in 2012. He went door to door, just like you're doing now. He wanted to file a group complaint with the state. I hadn't known this. What happened?" Helen's face clouded. "People were scared. Victor had just forced out the Hendersons, foreclosed on their lien, bought the house at auction, and flipped it for a profit. Everyone saw what happened to them. Your grandfather couldn't get 5 signatures." She paused. "He wasn't trying to prove anything, Mr. Howard. He was trying to build something, a coalition. But fear is a powerful thing." I drove back to my hotel with a new understanding. My grandfather hadn't failed because he lacked evidence. He'd failed because he'd been alone. The question now was whether I could succeed where he hadn't, by giving these people something to fight for instead of something to fear. The partial financial documents Derek Manning had given me were a starting point, but I needed the complete picture. Under Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-1258, any homeowner has the right to inspect HOA financial records upon written request. The problem was that I wasn't technically a homeowner. I was a landowner whose property had been illegally occupied. Diane and I debated the legal strategy for 2 days before settling on an approach. "We'll request the records on behalf of Helen Nakamura," she said. "She's still a member in good standing, and she's agreed to cooperate. If they refuse, we have grounds for a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate." Helen signed the request letter that afternoon. We sent it certified mail and waited. The HOA's response came 11 days later, 1 day past the statutory deadline. A single box arrived at Diane's office containing what the attached letter described as complete financial records for the past 5 fiscal years. Yet I spent the first hour organizing the contents: budget summaries, expense reports, contractor invoices, and bank reconciliation statements. At first glance, everything appeared orderly. Revenue matched expenditures, categories were clearly labeled. But I'd spent 12 years investigating corporate fraud, and I knew that the cleanest-looking books were often the dirtiest. The question wasn't what the documents showed, it was what they were designed to hide. I started with the contractor invoices. Derek's discovery documents had flagged Stanton Construction as a recurring vendor, but the records Helen received told a more complete story. Over the past 5 years, Stanton Construction has been paid $1.2 million for various projects. Each invoice was properly formatted, signed by Victor Stanton as HOA president, and countersigned by the board treasurer, a man named Leonard Marsh, whose signature appeared on nearly every financial document. I made a note to research Marsh separately, but first, I followed a different thread that had caught my attention. A vendor called Southwest Infrastructure Partners that appeared on 3 invoices totaling $89,000 for consultation services. The name sounded legitimate, but when I searched Arizona business registrations, nothing came up. I expanded to neighboring states, nothing. I called the phone number on the invoice and got a disconnected tone. A ghost vendor money paid to a company that didn't exist. The pattern with Stanton Construction was different, but equally damaging. I compared their invoices to actual market rates, calling 3 paving contractors in the Phoenix area for estimates on comparable work. The road resurfacing project in 2021 was billed at $340,000. The average competitor quote was $115,000. The pool equipment billed at $52,000 should have cost $18,000. Drainage work invoiced at $127,000 was quoted elsewhere at $40,000. I built a spreadsheet comparing Stanton Construction's charges against industry benchmarks. The total overcharge across 5 years came to approximately $860,000, but that assumed the work had actually been completed. I drove through Desert Crown Estates, photographing the roads, the pool, and the drainage systems. The roads had visible cracks inconsistent with recent resurfacing. The pool equipment looked a decade old. Either the work hadn't been done, or the invoices were elaborate fiction. Diane secured a subpoena for the HOA's actual bank statements, not the reconciliation summaries they'd provided, but the raw transaction records. It took 2 weeks of legal wrangling before the bank complied. When the statements arrived, I locked myself in my hotel room for 3 days, cross-referencing every transaction against the HOA's official documents. The discrepancies were systematic. Incoming dues matched almost perfectly. They'd been careful about tracking revenue, but outgoing payments told a different story. Several checks to Stanton Construction appeared in the bank records, with no corresponding invoices. 3 payments totaling $147,000 had been erased from the official record, and the payments to Southwest Infrastructure Partners, the ghost vendor, had been routed through an intermediary account before reaching their final destination. That intermediary account was where my own analysis diverged from anything my grandfather could have found. The bank statements showed monthly wire transfers to an account labeled DCE Administrative Reserve, small amounts, $5,000 to $8,000, flowing like clockwork. Over 5 years, approximately $320,000 had disappeared into this account. When Diane traced the registration, it led to a shell company called Desert Crown Enterprises LLC, registered in Nevada with no public officers. The registered agent was a Las Vegas law firm specializing in anonymous corporate structures. My grandfather's notebook mentioned concerns about administrative fees and unaccounted reserves, but he had never identified the shell company itself. He'd seen the smoke but hadn't found the fire. I had. The next step required a different kind of detective work. Nevada corporate records are partially public, but beneficial ownership is deliberately obscured. I couldn't prove Victor Stanton controlled Desert Crown Enterprises through official filings alone. So, I approached the problem sideways. The shell company had been registered in 2008, the same year Raymond Stanton died, and Victor assumed full control of the HOA. I requested the original incorporation documents from Nevada's Secretary of State, paying the expedited processing fee. When they arrived, the registered agent's signature was illegible, but the notary acknowledgement included a witness line. The witness was Gerald Hutchins, the same surveyor who had falsified the boundary plat in 1989 and lost his license in '94. Hutchins had remained connected to the Stanton family's schemes for nearly 2 decades after his supposed disgrace. The fraud wasn't just Victor, it was a network. I spent another day tracing Leonard Marsh, the board treasurer whose signature appeared on every financial document. He'd served on the HOA board since 2012, the same year my grandfather had tried to organize residents and failed. Marsh owned a small insurance agency in Scottsdale, and his business records showed a curious pattern shortly after becoming treasurer. His agency had been awarded the exclusive contract to provide HOA liability coverage for Desert Crown Estates. Another conflict of interest. Another person with reasons to keep the system running. The conspiracy had layers I was only beginning to understand. On my last day of financial analysis, I drove to the storage facility where my grandfather had rented a unit for 20 years. I'd hoped to find more documentation, and I did boxes of photographs, HOA meeting minutes, correspondence with county officials. But what struck me most was what I didn't find. My grandfather had tracked the inflated contracts. He'd noted the suspicious administrative fees. He'd even written "shell company" in the margin of a 2010 budget summary. But he'd never made the connection to Nevada, never identified Gerald Hutchins' continued involvement, never mapped the network of beneficiaries beyond Victor Stanton. He'd been working alone, without subpoena power, without forensic training, without allies. He'd gathered kindling for 30 years. I was the one who would finally light the match. I called Diane from the parking lot. "I have had enough," I said. "Land fraud, inflated contracts, ghost vendors, a shell company, and at least 3 people who've been profiting from the scheme. She let out a long breath. Then we need to decide how to use it. We can file quietly and let the legal system work. Or, I thought about Helen's trembling hands, Derek's 18-month fight, Sophia's nightmares. My grandfather died alone, his evidence scattered across boxes, waiting for someone to assemble the pieces he'd never been able to connect. There's an annual HOA meeting in 3 weeks, I said. Victor Stanton has spent 35 years operating in darkness. It's time to turn on the lights in front of everyone he's been stealing from. Diane paused. Public confrontation is riskier, more variables. But if you want maximum pressure, I looked at the storage facility in my rearview mirror, my grandfather's archive, finally ready to serve its purpose. He's had his entire career to hide. He won't get another chance. The 3 weeks before the annual meeting became the most intense of my life. Diane and I worked 18-hour days assembling the legal architecture that would support our public confrontation. We filed a quiet title lawsuit with the Maricopa County Superior Court, formally asserting my ownership of the 1,000 acres underlying Desert Crown Estates. We prepared a civil fraud complaint naming Victor Stanton, Stanton Construction LLC, Desert Crown Enterprises LLC, and Leonard Marsh as defendants. And we drafted a criminal referral packet for the Arizona Attorney General's office, documenting the embezzlement, self-dealing, and falsified records in meticulous detail. If this goes the way we hope, Diane said, reviewing the final documents, Stanton won't just lose his position, he'll lose his freedom. I also sought outside perspective. Through Diane's network, I connected with Professor Harold Jenkins, a retired law professor from Arizona State University who had spent 30 years studying HOA governance and abuse. We met at a coffee shop in Tempe, where he reviewed my evidence for nearly 2 hours. When he finished, he didn't offer praise, he offered strategy. Your documentation is solid, he said, but your approach has a vulnerability. If you present this as a personal grievance, grandson avenging grandfather, the board will frame you as an emotional outsider. The residents will sympathize with their neighbors, not you. He tapped the financial spreadsheets. Lead with the money. Every homeowner in that room has paid into a system that's been robbing them. Make it about their losses first, your land claims second. By the time you reveal the property fraud, they'll already be angry at the board, and they'll stay angry. Jenkins offered another tactical insight that reshaped my entire presentation. Arizona's open meeting law requires HOA boards to allow homeowner comments during designated periods, he explained. But most boards bury that period at the end of the agenda, after they've already voted on everything important. Check the meeting notice. If they've structured it that way, you'll need to force the issue early, or they'll adjourn before you can speak. I reviewed the agenda that night and found exactly what he'd predicted. Homeowner comments were scheduled as the final item. After routine approvals, budget ratification, and board elections, the meeting could easily run 3 hours before I got a chance to open my mouth, assuming they didn't find a procedural excuse to cut it short. I spent the next day researching Arizona HOA regulations until I found what I needed, a provision allowing any homeowner to request agenda modifications in writing at least 72 hours before a meeting. The board wasn't required to approve the modification, but they were required to acknowledge it publicly and explain any denial. I drafted a formal request to add presentation regarding financial irregularities and land title concerns as the second agenda item, submitted it through certified mail, and copied the Arizona Department of Real Estate. If they denied it, they'd have to do so on the record, and their reasons would become part of the official minutes. It was a small procedural lever, but in my experience, small levers could move heavy doors. With the legal framework in place, I turned to the community. I hand-delivered a 1-page letter to every mailbox in the subdivision, explaining that significant information regarding community governance and financial management would be presented at the annual meeting. Some residents watched from their windows. A few came outside to ask questions. Most simply took the letter and closed their doors. Within a week, the community message board was filled with speculation about what I was planning. The response confirmed something important: people were paying attention. Whether they'd be allies or obstacles remained to be seen. The retaliation came from multiple directions, none of them bearing Victor Stanton's direct fingerprints. Sentinel Property Management sent a formal letter to all homeowners warning about an individual making fraudulent claims and urging them to disregard unauthorized communications. Leonard Marsh followed up with an email to the community listserv describing me as a known litigant with a financial interest in disrupting our community. The HOA's attorney, a man named Richard Keller, whose firm had represented Desert Crown for 15 years, sent Diane a cease and desist letter threatening defamation claims if I made unsubstantiated accusations at the meeting. Each communication came from a different source, creating the appearance of organic community concern rather than coordinated suppression. The machine had many hands. The pressure extended to the people who had helped me. Helen Nakamura called on Tuesday evening, her voice unsteady. A representative from Sentinel had visited her home, claiming her lien payment was under review for compliance issues. Derek Manning's architectural modification request filed months earlier was suddenly denied without explanation. Sophia Reyes received notice that her account was being audited for irregularities. None of these actions was illegal. They were precisely calibrated to intimidate without creating liability. I documented everything, knowing that the pattern itself would eventually become evidence. I also noticed I was being followed. A white sedan appeared in my hotel parking lot 3 nights running, always occupied by a man pretending to study his phone. When I drove to meet Diane, the sedan maintained a careful distance. When I visited Helen's house, I parked across the street. The license plate traced to a corporate fleet registered to a private security firm in Scottsdale. Someone on the board had hired professionals. I filed a police report and kept photographing. Documentation was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. On Friday, Diane called with news. Victor Stanton's attorney reached out. They want to discuss the settlement. I felt my jaw tighten. "What's the offer?" She paused. $3 million. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, drop all claims, and walk away. $3 million. Enough to change my life. Enough to make the last month feel like a profitable detour rather than a mission. What do you think? Diane's response was measured. I think they wouldn't offer it if they weren't terrified of Tuesday. She let the silence stretch. This is your decision, Christopher. That night, I sat with the lockbox of my grandfather's documents. But I wasn't thinking about his decades of solitary struggle. I was thinking about what he had gotten wrong. He'd approached this as a legal problem requiring legal proof. He'd written letters, filed complaints, gathered evidence all directed at institutions that had no incentive to listen. He'd never understood that the real battlefield wasn't the courthouse. It was the community. The people who paid dues every month, who voted for board members, who had the collective power to demand accountability if someone showed them where to look. My grandfather had built an arsenal. I was going to hand it to an army. I called Diane. Tell them no, I said. I'll see Victor Stanton on Tuesday. The phone rang again at 11:47 on Monday night. Victor's voice was calm, almost friendly. $5 million, final offer, take it, and this all goes away. I let him finish. Mr. Stanton, Arizona is a one-party consent state. This conversation is being recorded, and I want you to know your money can't buy what I'm selling. I'll see you tomorrow. I hung up before he could respond. Outside, the white sedan sat in its usual spot. I closed the curtains and returned to my presentation. In 12 hours, the lights were coming on. The Desert Crown Community Center was already half full when I arrived at 6:15 on Tuesday evening. The meeting was scheduled for 7, but residents had started gathering early, some out of curiosity about the mysterious letters, others because the board had urged attendance to show support for community leadership. I recognized Helen Nakamura sitting near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Derek Manning had positioned his wheelchair at the end of a row near the center aisle. Sophia Reyes stood against the wall with her sister. Professor Jenkins sat in the third row, a yellow legal pad open on his knee. Diane had taken a seat near the front, close enough to intervene if anything went legally sideways. The board members entered at 6:45 through a side door, Victor Stanton in a navy blazer, looking polished and confident, Leonard Marsh close behind, clutching a leather portfolio, and 3 other directors whose names I'd learned through my research. They arranged themselves at a long table facing the audience. Behind them, a projector screen displayed the HOA logo and the words, Annual Meeting Building Community Together. Victor surveyed the crowd with satisfaction, perhaps believing they'd come to support him. At 7:05, he called the meeting to order. Before we begin the formal agenda, I want to address some recent disturbances. You may have received unauthorized communications from an individual named Christopher Howard. I want to assure you that these claims are baseless, and our attorneys are handling the matter. Point of order. I stood from my seat in the middle of the room. 200 heads turned. Victor's eyes found mine, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly the first crack. Under Arizona Revised Statute Section 33-18-03, I submitted a formal request 72 hours ago to add a presentation to tonight's agenda. The board is required to acknowledge that request and state whether it was approved or denied. Leonard Marsh leaned over and whispered something. Victor nodded, his fingers drumming once against the table. The board received Mr. Howard's request and denied it as procedurally improper. Homeowner comments will be addressed at the end of the meeting. Then I'd like that denial entered into the official minutes, I said, along with my written request, which I've provided to the Arizona Department of Real Estate. I gestured toward a woman in a gray suit sitting near Diane. Victor's hand froze mid-drum. He hadn't expected a state regulator. We'll take that under advisement, he said, his voice slightly tighter than before. Now, moving to the first agenda item. Point of order. Derek Manning's voice carried across the room. If we're discussing community finances tonight, I think we should hear what Mr. Howard has to say before we vote on anything. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A man in the front row turned around. I recognized him from the community directory as Frank Bellamy, a 15-year resident and frequent defender of the board on the message boards. Hold on, he said. I've lived here since 2009. Victor has kept this community running smoothly for almost 2 decades. We're just going to let some outsider hijack our meeting. Several heads nodded, but Derek didn't back down. I've been here 12 years, Frank, and I've had questions about how this board operates for a long time. I want answers. Another resident stood. Let him speak. Then another. The room was splitting, but momentum was building. Victor raised his hand, and I watched his smile become fixed, performative. Fine. Mr. Howard, you have 10 minutes. The board reserves the right to respond to any inaccuracies. I walked to the front, connected my laptop to the projector, and began exactly where Professor Jenkins had advised with their money. Over the past 10 years, this HOA has collected approximately $2 million in special assessments and fines beyond your regular dues. I want to show you where that money went. My first slides displayed the inflated contracts road, resurfacing billed at $340,000, when competitors quoted $115, pool equipment at triple market rate, drainage work invoiced at nearly 4 times the going price. Photographs showed the actual conditions: cracked roads, aging equipment. The contractor on every major project, I said, is Stanton Construction, LLC. The president of your HOA has been approving contracts to his own company at prices far above market value. Leonard Marsh leaned into his microphone. Those comparisons are misleading. Different contractors have different overhead structures. Mr. Howard is cherry-picking quotes without understanding the complexity of commercial contracting. His voice was steady, but I noticed his hand gripping his pen too tightly. I clicked to my next slide. I anticipated that objection. Here are the actual invoices from Stanton Construction, alongside the detailed estimates I received, same scope of work, same specifications, same timeline. The methodology is transparent. Anyone can verify it. I looked at Marsh. Would you like to explain why Stanton Construction consistently charges 3 times what other licensed contractors quote for identical work? Marsh didn't answer. In the audience, Frank Bellamy's skeptical expression had begun to waver. Victor glanced at his watch. Mr. Howard, your 10 minutes are, let him finish. The shout came from somewhere in the middle of the room. Others joined in. Victor's face flushed slightly. He tried to regain control. This is a formal meeting with procedures. Then suspend the procedures. Derek Manning's voice cut through. We have a right to hear this. Victor looked at his fellow board members. None of them met his eyes. He sat back down, his fingers now gripping the edge of the table. The procedural authority had slipped away from him. I continued to the ghost vendor. Southwest Infrastructure Partners received $89,000 for consultation services. This company does not exist in any state business registry. The phone number is disconnected. I've provided the documentation to the ADRI representative in attendance. I heard gasps. I saw Helen Nakamura wiping her eyes. Frank Bellamy was now leaning forward, his skepticism replaced by something closer to alarm. Leonard Marsh attempted another deflection. Administrative vendors sometimes operate under different business structures. There is no structure, I said. There is no company. The money went to an entity that exists only on these invoices. The next slide showed the wire transfers to Desert Crown Enterprises, LLC. Over 5 years, $320,000 was transferred from your accounts to this Nevada shell company. No public officers, no business operations, no purpose except to receive money that should have stayed in your community. I displayed the incorporation document. This company was created in 2008. The witness signature belongs to Gerald Hutchins, the same surveyor who falsified the boundary plat that allowed this development to be built. Victor was standing now, his polished composure visibly cracking. Sweat had appeared at his temples. This is your taking isolated documents and constructing a conspiracy. His voice had risen half an octave. The board member beside him shifted away slightly. I have one more thing to show you. The 1952 deed filled the screen. 1,000 acres. The Howard family name. This land was never legally transferred from my grandfather's estate. Crown Development Group claimed in 1989 that this was unowned desert acreage. That was a lie. There is no deed transfer in the county records. There was no auction. This community was built on land that did not belong to the developers. The room erupted, people shouting questions, turning to neighbors, standing from their seats. Even Frank Bellamy was on his feet, his face red with anger, but no longer directed at me. Victor grabbed his microphone. These are the lies of someone trying to extort. Last night, I said, and the room quieted just enough. You called me and offered $5 million to walk away. I recorded that conversation. You knew exactly what you were buying. Something in Victor finally broke. His face contorted, and 18 years of careful performance collapsed in an instant. Your grandfather was a senile old fool who couldn't let go, he shouted, his voice cracking. We built this community. We created value from nothing. Without my father, this would still be an empty desert. He swept his arm across the room. You all benefited everyone, and now you're going to sit here and let this outsider. He stopped. The silence was absolute. 200 people stared at him, as if seeing him for the first time. The ADRI representative was writing rapidly. Diane was already on her phone. Margaret Chen, a 20-year resident, stood slowly. I moved that the board to be suspended immediately pending a full independent audit. Seconded, thirded. The vote wasn't even close. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I found Victor's eyes one last time. His board members had distanced themselves. His residents were demanding answers. His carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter, the weight of 35 years finally lifting. The morning after the annual meeting, the Arizona Department of Real Estate opened a formal investigation. By week's end, the FBI had joined, citing potential wire fraud and money laundering. Victor Stanton was arrested at his home. Leonard Marsh was taken in for questioning the same afternoon. The dominoes fell faster than any of us had anticipated, but I kept reminding myself this wasn't my victory alone. It belonged to Derek's discovery documents, Helen's courage to file the records request, Sophia's initiative when our case wobbled, Professor Jenkins's strategic guidance, and Diana's legal architecture. The community had voted to suspend the board. That collective act was the turning point. The legal process took 14 months. It wasn't smooth. 5 months in, Victor's attorneys filed a motion to suppress Helen's records request, arguing she'd acted as my agent. The motion was partially granted. 3 years of records were temporarily excluded. For 6 weeks, our case wobbled. Sophia organized 11 homeowners to file identical requests, creating a paper trail too broad to suppress. When the appeals court restored the documents, I understood how close we'd come to losing everything. The quiet title lawsuit was resolved first. A judge ruled unequivocally that the 1,000 acres had never been legally transferred from the Howard estate. I filed a proposal offering 99-year land leases to current homeowners at $1 per year. Most accepted with relief. 17 families sold and left rather than live under the Howard cloud. Their departures created unexpected problems. 8 homes sat vacant for months, and the HOA faced budget shortfalls from unpaid dues. Victor Stanton was indicted on 17 counts. His attorneys fought relentlessly, but the paper trail was too complete. He accepted a plea agreement, 12 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and permanent prohibition from any fiduciary capacity. Leonard Marsh cooperated with prosecutors and received 4 years plus $340,000 in restitution. Gerald Hutchins, the surveyor whose falsified plat started everything, died before sentencing, taking details about Raymond Stanton's involvement that will never recover. The financial recovery exceeded $1.4 million distributed to victims, but approximately $300,000 from the ghost vendor was never traced. Perfect justice remained elusive. The community's transformation belonged to the residents themselves. Derek Manning was elected president, Helen Nakamura became treasurer, Sophia Reyes chaired the Financial Oversight Committee, but self-governance proved harder than expected. 2 committee chairs resigned from burnout within 6 months, and a dispute over landscaping contracts nearly split the board. Democracy requires constant maintenance. The entrance sign now reads, Howard Community Established, 1989, Restored 24. Not everyone celebrated. Bill Thornton organized a countergathering of 15 residents who still believe I did more harm than good. The community remains divided, even in victory. Over 18 months, I spent nearly $220,000 on legal fees and lost income. Justice brings responsibility, not resolution. The wounds are healing unevenly, imperfectly, but healing. 6 months after Victor's sentencing, I drove to the cemetery outside Phoenix where my grandfather was buried. The desert morning was cool, the sky that particular shade of pale blue that only exists in Arizona before the heat arrives. I knelt beside his headstone, Walter James Howard, 1931 to 23, he never stopped fighting, and placed a yellow chrysanthemum on the granite. Helen had taught me the symbolism. I also left a certified copy of the quiet title Judgment. It's official now, I said quietly. Every acre. The county recorder has your name on file. But I know that's not what mattered to you. You cared about the truth. They know now. I thought about the journey, the crumpled deed, Victor's sneer at the gate, the weeks of document analysis, the moment Derek demanded they let me speak. None of it had been clean or simple, but it had been necessary. I'd returned to Chicago briefly after sentencing, intending to resume my forensic accounting career, but something had shifted. Derek called 3 weeks ago with an unexpected request. A homeowner in Nevada had heard about Desert Crown. Her HOA was exhibiting similar patterns, inflated contracts, silenced residents. She wanted help. You're good at this, Christopher, Derek said. Better than you know. I hadn't answered yet. The idea of becoming an HOA investigator felt strange, but I couldn't stop thinking about how many communities lived under quiet tyranny. How many people had evidence in boxes waiting for someone with the skills to make sense of it? The drive back to Howard Community took 40 minutes. As I turned through the gate, I noticed something new: chrysanthemums planted along the entrance median, yellow ones swaying in the breeze. Helen Nakamura was kneeling nearby, trowel in hand. She looked up and smiled. I thought the entrance needed color, and I figured no one would find me this time. I laughed a real laugh. They look beautiful, Helen. She stood slowly, brushing soil from her gloves. Your grandfather would have liked them. He always said this place could be something good if the right people were in charge. She gestured at the community behind her. I think we're getting there. I looked at the chrysanthemums, at Helen's dirt-stained gloves, at the sign bearing my family's name. My grandfather had spent 35 years dreaming of this moment. He hadn't lived to see it, but he was here anyway in the flowers, in the people who had finally found courage. Yeah, I said softly. I think we are.